Are you also tired of one-size-fits-all weight loss plans? Meet Noom, the personalized solution that meets you where you are. Noom is able to understand your unique needs, from dietary restrictions to medical concerns. Unlike restrictive programs, Noom embraces your lifestyle and choices. Discover a sustainable approach to weight loss, tailored just for you. Honestly, Noom felt like it was made for me. It's not just about what I eat, it's about understanding why. With Noom, I've learned so much about myself and built healthier habits that stick. It's all about progress, not perfection. Say goodbye to restrictive diets and experience the Noom app for yourself with personalized lessons and expert coaching. Noom's psychology and biology-based approach has helped over 5.2 million people achieve their goals. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. And check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
At the UPS Store, we know things can get busy this upcoming holiday. You can count on us to be open and ready to help with any packing and shipping or anything else you might need.
Is there anything you can't do?
Actually, I don't have a good singing voice. The UPS... Nope. But our certified packing experts can pack and ship just about anything.
At least that's good.
The UPS Store. Be unstoppable. Most locations are independently owned. Product, services, pricing, and hours of operation may vary. See Center for details. Come in today to get your holiday goodies there on time.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I am coming to you live from Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have beside me Elizabeth Bosscher, who is a bookseller here at the bookstore. She has worked here for a couple of years. I already absolutely love her. We've been sitting here together as people have trickled in. We've got a wonderful audience of people in front of us, and I just can't wait to talk about The Busybody with all of them, and by extension with all of you, which I haven't been able to do other than to promo events like this kind of nonstop for the last couple of weeks. And I cringe every time I'm doing it because it always feels like I'm taking away from the conversation having to do with mysteries. But for once on this very episode, this live episode here, I can talk about The Busybody, and I will be talking about mystery as well. And that's very exciting to me.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, take it away.
Like Kemper said, my name is Elizabeth Bosscher, and I'm the events coordinator here at Schuler Books. For those listening on the podcast, Schuler Books is an independent bookstore with 4 locations in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, Okemos, Ann Arbor, and West Bloomfield. So if you're anywhere nearby, we would love for you to stop by. And for those in our audience, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited about this. If you enjoy coming to events like this, we would encourage you to follow along with our e-newsletter, as well as on our Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok to find out about more opportunities in our stores. Today, I'm so excited to have Kemper Donovan here. I think you all know who he is, but I'm going to read his bio anyway. Kemper Donovan is an acclaimed author and host of the podcast All About Agatha. A graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, he worked at the literary management company Circle of Confusion for a decade before transitioning to writing full-time. He is a member of the New York Bar Association, PEN America, and Mystery Writers of America. He lives with his husband and daughters in Los Angeles. Welcome, Kemper.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And I feel a little giddy about the fact that I get to host Kemper's podcast today.
This is very, very cool. I think I mentioned this on a previous episode, but at one point I was thinking, should I just interview myself about this book? A funny joke that would probably be only funny for about 5 minutes and then get really awkward really fast. So I am so thrilled that you are here hosting. Yeah, really hosting. You're not even a co-host. You basically have just taken over and you are officially hosting this episode since I'm the author here for this episode.
Yeah, because I want to know all about your book and you are the star of this moment. So talking about that, I always like to start my events by getting the author to describe the book themselves. I think that we could read the little description if we wanted, but it's always more interesting coming from the person who wrote it. So what is The Busybody? What's it about?
Okay, so I'm not going to give the quote-unquote elevator pitch here since I don't need to. This is a podcast episode, and the expectation is you're all going to be listening for more than the length of an elevator ride. So I don't have to be super quick, and I actually want to answer that question by way of referencing Agatha Christie, which will come as a surprise to precisely no one. So there are a ton of tributes to Agatha Christie built into this book. And I can see people in the audience who have read the book nodding along here. One of the tributes that I think is not as obvious as many of the others is the fact that Christie built a lot of real-life scenarios into her novels. And I've talked a bit about this. Catherine Brobeck and I have talked a bit about this on the podcast before. The way that Christie would reference true crime cases, for example. And, most people are aware of what she did with the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, which forms the backstory of Murder on the Orient Express. I also just recently, in my marathon 4+ hour episode all about the mousetrap, I talked about a case of foster care gone horrifically awry and even interviewed one of the family members who had been directly involved or at least affected by what happened within his family. Christie, though, did a whole lot more referencing than that, and there are some of these people that I've spoken about on the podcast a little bit. Dr. Crippen, Edith Thompson. She did a lot more ripping from the headlines than you would think. And I think that's one of the 8,932 reasons why she is as enduring as she is. And it's something that she doesn't get a lot of credit for. So what I did with The Busybody was to reference a major event in recent U.S. history, which will, I think, be pretty obvious to anyone in the United States, at least, when they're reading the book. And Catherine and I started this podcast 7.5 years ago. So that was in September of 2016. And just a couple months after we started the podcast was the 2016 presidential election. So that was the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. A rather tumultuous time, regardless of your political affiliation. Okay, and kind of appropriate. I'm in Michigan, sort of a swing state.
Yep.
I'm usually on either coast. I'm doing this in a swing state. This is exciting. You may remember after that election, a lot of people were just wondering what Hillary Clinton was up to. There was a period where people were taking pictures of her on walks behind her house, where she was taking long walks in the woods. And it was just a really bizarre time. And something about this weirdo moment in time just stuck with me as the perfect setting for a murder mystery, both on a macro scale, because the country was going through something together, even if they disagreed about the outcome. It's like we were all going through something together as a country, and on a micro scale as to this individual, as to what it was actually like dealing with the aftermath of this moment. So The Busybody starts when a ghostwriter who specializes in celebrity memoir is contacted by this politician, Dorothy Gibson, and she has just recently lost the election for president of the United States in a very public way. And she had always been meaning to write a personal memoir, but she didn't have any time. And now, of course, she has all the time in the world in the wake of this very public defeat. So she eventually hires this ghostwriter, and the ghostwriter is the first-person narrator of the story. But if you were wondering what this woman's name is, I'm afraid I cannot tell you because she is never named in the story, not even once. She's a very enigmatic and withholding character, and I was partly inspired here by Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which podcast listeners will know is a longtime favorite book of mine and Catherine Brobeck's. We actually covered Rebecca, the text, and then 4 of the film adaptations of Rebecca on our Patreon account, and that was a lot of fun.
If I can interrupt for a second,
yes.
I listened to this book a few months ago now. I got an early listen to it. And I went today to make notes, and I went to note about the character names. And I forgot that the narrator didn't have a name, and I had to look it up because I was like, wait, there has to be a name somewhere. Anyway, I think it's a fascinating part that you decided to include.
Thank you. I've gotten that comment before, and I take it as a big compliment. Then I think some people say, I didn't even realize that she didn't have a name until about halfway through the book when I was like, what is her name? And part of it was the challenge of just having a narrator who wasn't named. Yeah. And Daphne du Maurier talked about that. That was part of the reason why she did it as well. So I think we relished it for similar reasons. So The politician, Dorothy Gibson, obviously is somewhat based on Hillary Clinton, but she's only partially inspired by Hillary Clinton. And I just want to touch on a group of female politicians from earlier in the 20th century who I was also inspired by when I was creating the character of Dorothy Gibson, because I think this will be of interest to some people. So there was this phenomenon known as widow's mandate. What that meant was when a male politician died, and this was earlier in the 20th century, sometimes his widow was called upon to fill out his term until a more suitable, I'm using air quotes here for all those who can't see me, until a more suitable replacement could be found. And by suitable, I do unfortunately mean male. But many of these women did not go away, and they embarked on political careers of their own. And one of the most successful cases of widow's mandate is a Republican senator named Margaret Chase Smith. And she got her start in U.S. politics when her husband passed away. He was a U.S. representative for the state of Maine. So she became a U.S. representative, but then she went on to become a U.S. senator for many decades. She's probably best remembered today for delivering this fiery denunciation of McCarthyism on the Senate floor. It was called the Declaration of Conscience, and it was a big moment. I actually referenced the Declaration of Conscience in The Busybody. So there's a lot of Margaret Chase Smith in Dorothy Gibson as well. And these two women, they settle in to work on this memoir together in the state of Maine, because Dorothy Gibson is a former senator from Maine, just like Margaret Chase Smith. And after a couple of days, they make a run to a liquor store for some much needed red wine, as one does. While they're there, they run into a woman named Vivian Davis. And Dorothy has never met Vivian before, even though she says, oh, we're neighbors. But strangers come up to Dorothy all the time, especially in the wake of the election. And Vivian says how sorry she is about the fact that Dorothy lost and how worried she is about what's going to happen now that the person who won is going to become president, because this is all taking place in that interim period between the election and the inauguration. We're in late November, early December here. Dorothy and the ghostwriter kind of brush off this interaction because Vivian Davis is a bit of an annoyance. But a few days later, they learn that Vivian Davis has died, seemingly by her own hand. She's found drowned in her bathtub with a bottle of sleeping pills by her side. But something about this doesn't sit right with Dorothy, so she drags herself and her ghostwriter to Vivian's memorial, where they interact with a suspicious cast of characters, all the people who were assembled at the house where Vivian passed away. And after the memorial, both out of curiosity and in an effort to be helpful, Dorothy speeds along the toxicology report for Vivian Davis. Since, as any mystery aficionado will tell you, I'm sure many of you know this, the way it takes 2 seconds for the tox report to come back in a Law and Order episode is totally bogus. And yet I needed that to happen in my book. So what I did is that I had Dorothy wield her local influence to goose along the proceedings. And the toxicology report comes back very soon after she requests it. And lo and behold, what they learn is that Vivian Davis didn't have a single drug in her body. And that kind of begins the murder investigation, which is very much spearheaded in an amateur way by Dorothy Gibson and her ghostwriter sidekick. We do also have 2 policemen who are engaging in a parallel investigation. Spoiler, they don't do very well in their investigation. And really the mystery proceeds from there. It sort of deepens before it unravels, very much in the form of a classic murder mystery. So there are clues that the reader can use to solve what's happening here at the same time Dorothy and the ghostwriter do, or maybe even before they do. And then one other detail I just want to mention, this was a crazily long-winded answer to what's the busybody about? But this is what happens when you have a podcast host do an author event, unfortunately. Just one other detail I want to mention is that this is the first book in a series. It was sold as the first of 3 books. And my little innovation on the genre is that I'm going to have instead of having my detective sidekick duo travel from book to book as they would in a more traditional work of detective fiction, it's going to be my enigmatic ghostwriter alone who will travel from book to book. So this is going to be a sidekick series in which my sidekick ghostwriter teams up with a new detective in each new setting. And that's just my way of keeping things a little fresh.
I love that. I'm very excited about book 2, which I don't think we'll have to wait terribly long for.
No, coming out January 2025.
There we go. All right. As the co-creator and host of the All About Agatha podcast, you've obviously been talking about classic mysteries for years. And I know that this is your second book technically, but it's the first in this kind of traditional classic mystery style. What was it that pushed you from being someone who talked about mysteries to someone who wrote about mysteries?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that I was the co-creator of the podcast, and obviously everyone listening, or most people listening to this podcast, already know this. But just for anyone in the audience today who's not a listener, All About Agatha started 7.5 years ago, but for those first 5 years, I co-hosted the podcast. It was very much a joint venture with my good friend Catherine Brobeck, and she passed away at the end of 2021. And I dedicated this book to Catherine. I couldn't not dedicate it to Catherine. It would have been crazy to dedicate it to anyone else. And the reason why kind of answers your question, because it was while Catherine and I were reading and reviewing and ranking and just poring over every word that Agatha Christie wrote. It was in the early years of the podcast that I realized how insane it would be to not try my hand at writing a mystery of my own. I had written one other book. My debut novel was not a mystery. It's called The Decent Proposal, and that came out in April of 2016. So really just a couple of months before I started the podcast. And for the first few years of the podcast, I really struggled with my sophomore novel, which is a very cliched thing for a writer to do. Lots of writers have a really hard time writing that second novel, and I definitely did. And I sort of beat my head against the proverbial wall for a while, and I wrote one manuscript that I'm still holding on to. So we'll see if something ever comes of that. But I realized by way of all the work that I had done with Catherine that I must be really passionate about this if I'm not sick of Agatha Christie and mysteries. I was spending tens of hours every week reading these novels, then thinking about the novels, then arguing with Catherine about what we were going to say about them and how we were going to analyze them. We put out episodes that were always less than an hour back then because I thought it was important for the episodes to be short. Ha ha ha. That is... And Catherine was the one who was always like, why are you so obsessed with that? Who cares? And she was totally right. She was right about everything. But, and then I would have to edit them. And I still loved Christie and I loved mystery. So I figured I need to take the plunge. But it was a plunge because what I worried about from the start, and it's something that I think always have to keep an eye on, is that you never want to fall into the trap as a writer of being imitative. Or at least imitative in the wrong way. And I think that with Christie, I have tried to be inspired by her puzzle construction, because I think that is something that you can lift out of to a certain extent. You can lift out some of the tools and the tricks and the tropes, which is what Catherine and I were doing on the podcast, and sort of figuring out how she did what she did in a puzzle way. I think you can draw on some of those same tricks for yourself as a writer, but you have to make sure that your voice is your own and that your characterization is your own, and that all of those writerly aspects of the novel, that I'm not trying to imitate Christie's voice, for example, because I wouldn't be able to. It would be terrible. So having to bifurcate in that way is tricky, and something that I still really think a lot about very consciously.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about some of those tricks. In Agatha Christie novels, there are obviously different tricks she uses and things she repeats. What did you pull on specifically for this title?
Well, and it's going to be hard to talk about this without... This is where I would just completely spoil away if I were talking about an Agatha Christie novel, where I'd say, fast forward a couple of minutes right now if you haven't yet read The Busybody.
We are attempting to do a spoiler-free conversation today.
We're attempting to do spoiler-free for everyone here in the audience who hasn't yet read, and also for those who might be listening in territories that can't even buy it yet. So I really will try not to spoil, but I will say this: there are certain tricks of Christie's that Catherine and I would talk about a lot on the podcast, even joke about a lot on the podcast. And I knew when I started planning this novel that I wanted to specifically use a number of those, because it would make podcast listeners chuckle. And they'd be like, oh, I see what Kemper's doing there. He is using... And I haven't gotten negative feedback about this, but there was one person who contacted me, or maybe it was a comment in a review or something, and I was foolish enough to read the comments on an internet piece, which I rarely ever do. But I think someone said, like, I can't believe that Kemper was using one of those sort of Christie tricks that he would always make fun of her using. Like, doesn't he realize that, he's being hypocritical? And I was like, no, I Catherine and I would poke fun at Christie in, I think, about the most loving way you possibly could, because we loved everything that she did. But there were certain things that she would do a lot, and certain tricks that when you really start analyzing the books, you realize that, oh, she went to that well many, many times. And I'll just say they sometimes would have to do with what we would call costuming clues, as just a sort of umbrella term. And Christie pulled it off so well, and I knew that I wanted to employ some of that in my book. I won't say any more than that because I'm really edging into spoiler territory. And I wanted the book to be a little easier to solve for podcast listeners also. And it's not just as to a quote unquote costume include. There are a couple of other little tropes and scenarios that Catherine and I would always point out Christie liked to use often, especially in her short stories. This is something else I wish I could get more specific, but I can't. And I think that longtime listeners, avid listeners, will immediately pick up on those and see the significance of them in a way that a regularly astute mystery reader might not. And that's okay. I hope that it is a little bit easier for a podcast listener to solve. But I will say this, I'm only doing that for the first book.
Not for the rest.
Not for the rest. The rest, you're on your own. It's a level playing field. That was like just my little, I said I built in all these homages to Agatha Christie. That's my little homage to All About Agatha specifically.
That's so fun, though. I'm going to throw this. I didn't warn you about this one, but I listened to one of your episodes where you were speaking with another author who kind of analyzed parts of Agatha Christie novels and like how many times someone died in the hallway and someone died in the bedroom.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you remember how many times someone died in the bathroom? Because yours, the murder occurs in the bathroom.
I don't remember. Was it a lot?
I also don't remember. This was a bad question.
No. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, Agatha Christie is someone who, the domestic sphere was very much the sphere that she was interested in. I've talked a little bit on the podcast about my love for Wilkie Collins as well. And he's another author who really did the same thing. I mean, he's one of the first, and he was writing in the mid-Victorian era, where he took the suspense and sort of thriller story, which before him had more or less been, in Gothic castles and just kind of more heightened kinds of settings, and he placed those stories and all of that horror and those thrills into a very recognizable contemporary domestic setting. And I think Christie often did that as well. So there's just so much domesticity in her book. So every single room in the house is just absolutely deadly. And I think that I definitely did the same thing. And it's why one of the other things that I think some readers have pointed out is that I have not just one house, but two. In the book, because, first we get to know Dorothy Gibson's house, which is surrounded by woods, and there are walks in the woods in this book, because of course there have to be. But the murder actually takes place at a neighboring estate, which is this very unusual house called the Crystal Palace. And it's not even a regular house where people live year round. It's more of an event space that people can live in short term, which is what's happening when Vivian Davis dies. And I think that the reason I invested the story in those two domestic spaces, that it was almost like two for the price of one. Like it was just more domesticity, and it felt like I was doing more of that domestic scene setting like Christie does.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. I hadn't really contemplated myself that before, but many other mysteries, the death occurs at the river or in a public place or something like that. And it is very Christie-ish to put it in a home.
Yes. And terrifying.
And terrifying,
It speaks to us as mystery readers.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay, I want to go back to that nameless narrator for a second.
Sure.
It was a choice that you made. My curious question is, have you named them in your head?
I haven't really.
Okay.
So I did not set out to have a nameless narrator when I first started writing the book. And actually, I can always make an analogy to Christie for pretty much anything that I'm talking about. But I think this one has a really easy analogy, because one of my favorite things I learned from John Curran's books, Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, where he sort of translates what Agatha Christie was doing when she was coming up with her plots, is that even for her highest concept novels, even for something like Crooked House, and I won't say what the concept is, but for all who have read Crooked House, you're going to know what I mean here. She did not start the book saying, well, I know that X did it. this is going to be my ex did it book. She would just have a cast of characters and she'd play around with it and be like, oh, maybe this person could have done it, or maybe that person could have done it. And there was a sort of organic quality to her writing that I think she often doesn't get credit for, because her concepts are so outlandish and impressive when you get to the solution. It seems like, oh, well, that has to be the raison d'etre of the whole book. And not necessarily. And because her characters really are very strong, even though she doesn't always get credit for that. And similarly, the ghostwriter's name did not come to me when I started writing her, and then it continued to not come to me. And I said, she's an enigmatic, she's a withholding sort of a character. There is a little bit of a serialized intrigue as to who she is and what's going on in her past, which I will carry on from book to book, not in a way that will require any of the books to be read in order, but will provide some connective tissue that I think readers will appreciate. I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, basically. We'll see if it works out, because the second book isn't even out yet, but that's what I'm trying to do. And making her nameless just seemed to go along with that aspect of who she was. So yeah, believe it or not, it really did develop organically. And now what I'm trying to do is to write these 3 books, because I have a 3-book deal. Potentially in success, I might write more of these books. I would love to. I have other ideas. So I'm trying to figure out how to write these 3 books to some sort of a satisfying conclusion as to the ghostwriter that still leaves room for more. So yeah, it's this balancing act of providing some answers, but not all of the answers. And yes, to be honest with you, I really don't. It's not like I'm holding something back.
Yeah.
She's the one holding back from me.
Yeah.
And I hate it, by the way, and I hate when writers say that, the thing of like, oh, your characters are saying nothing. They're in your head. You crazy person. But look at me. Now I'm saying the same thing.
Okay, I'm going to maybe push you a little bit on this one.
Please.
So when you rank Christie books on the podcast, you always discuss moments when she pulls on the recent events of her time and if those comparisons or plot points have aged well. Now, thinking that in The Busybody, you have pulled on the events of the 2016 election and the political landscape of that time, do you think about, like, what if someone was analyzing my book from this lens in a decade, 2 decades, and how they might feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I always, and this is the issue of depiction stuck in their time, as we call it on the podcast, and it's something that Catherine and I never wanted to shy away from, because I think it's an issue that most people or many people have when they're reading Christie. It's kind of, how do you negotiate when you come across something you're like, oh wow, that feels really out of sync with where I am with my thoughts on X, because I'm reading it, so much later than it was written. So we always try to approach these issues with a ton of humility, since, we're analyzing them from one place in time as well. I mean, the second that we make that analysis, it becomes outdated, right? And, the podcast was in 2016. I'm sure there's something that we said in 2016 that from 2024 is feels a little weird or wrongheaded. That's how quickly these things age, because they're about intimate aspects of how we live our lives, right? So I've always tried to approach it with humility, which would mean that I would hope that people would also be as forgiving to me. But the other issue is we're reading Christie 100 plus years in the future from when she was publishing. So I would love to be lucky enough for someone to read The Busybody in 21, 24 and say, wow, this feels really sexist or something like that. And I'm sure they could and would. So, that counts as a major, major champagne problem to me. And it only gets exacerbated by the greater the staying power of your books. And I've made this point before, but it bears repeating that I think Agatha Christie actually overall acquits herself quite well when it comes to depictions stuck in their time. Because if you do read other writers from the Golden Age whose work has not stood the test of time as much, one of the reasons why is that a lot of what they were writing feels a lot more old-fashioned and out of step. She actually was remarkably, I think, restrained with how she portrayed a lot of different aspects of the human condition. Not even restrained, left a lot of room for readerly interpretation. So, not only do I approach those issues with humility, I actually think that overall I admire what she did, even though I'm not minimizing those issues for people who are reading the books.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, these kinds of mysteries obviously take a lot of research, and you've obviously done a lot of research for The Busybody. But as you were researching, was there anything that kind of sent you down a weird rabbit hole?
So I mentioned the Crystal Palace, which is the house pretty much where the murder mystery takes place. That is based off of the real life Crystal Palace, which is in England and was the site of this great exhibition in the middle of the 19th century. That really comes from my love of Victorian literature, which I have been nurturing since I was probably about 10 years old, just after Agatha Christie. I read almost all of Agatha Christie's work, and then I didn't move on, but I then expanded out into other genres, and I've got stuck on the Victorians, and I've never left them or Agatha Christie. So that was a way of kind of combining those two loves. I definitely went on lots of rabbit holes about the Crystal Palace, mainly because I wanted to. There was a little bit of true crime nerddom that I engaged in that I just want to shout out for podcast listeners who might appreciate this. There's a case called the Brides in the Bath case, which is a very famous true crime case from the early 20th century. And it involves this pathologist, Bernard Spilsbury, who actually, I believe that my podcasting associate, Caroline Crampton on She Done It, which I'm sure a bunch of you also listened to. I think she even did a whole episode on Bernard Spilsbury. She certainly has mentioned him before. He is this forensic pathologist who was like a superstar in the early 20th century. And he was able to crack this case called The Brides in the Bath, which involved 3 women who were found drowned in their bathtub. So this actually comes into play in the solving of the mystery in The Busybody. So that was another really fun rabbit hole and another way for me to do what Christie was doing and insert some of those true crime elements into a fictional mystery, which I just think is, I don't know, it sort of fascinates me as a mystery reader. I love when Christie does that, so I wanted to do that as a writer as well.
Thinking about your characters, what characters did you have the most fun writing?
I mean, maybe this will be another annoying writerly answer, but all of them, there needed to be a reason for all of them to exist. And I think sometimes with mysteries, people feel like, oh, well, at least some of the characters among your cast of suspects must be expendable because you have to have so many to have a robust mystery. But I really pushed back on that as a writer. And I was like, no, each of these characters needs to be not only believable, but also interesting and crucial somehow to not only the plot, but also sort of the underlying themes of just what I'm exploring here as a writer. So I really took my time with that. I hope that comes through. They really are a sort of like wacky, kooky cast of characters. So if I had to pick the one character I had the most fun writing, it's probably the ghostwriter. She's our first person narrator. She's got lots of asides. There's definitely a certain snark element to her. Some of my more misanthropic tendencies myself, I was able to vent through her a little bit. So she was a lot of fun to write. Her voice was really fun to inhabit.
So if you had fun writing all of them, were there any that you struggled with, though, that didn't feel like they came as naturally?
That's a really good question. There's a character that I ended up really liking, but Dorothy has an assistant. Her name is Layla Mansour in the book, and she bears a striking physical similarity to Hillary Clinton's longtime personal aide and confidant, Huma Abedin. Most people probably kind of know what Huma Abedin looks like. And I think in the beginning I struggled with differentiating her, like making her and like really kind of drilling down on what her relationship was like with Dorothy, because I don't know what Hillary Clinton's relationship actually is with Huma Abedin, and that wouldn't be interesting if I was just trying to replicate that for this book. So really figuring out what their relationship is, because it's quite important actually to the novel. So that was a challenge, but something that I ultimately did enjoy once I got there.
This is a question that I ask to a lot of authors in different genres because people seem to be really interested in the answer. Are there any characters that you've based off of people that you know in real life? Besides the Hillary Clinton and like those kind of obvious connections.
Sure, like people in my own personal life. Yes, I mean... And it's the thing too of there's little pieces of you in every character. I think you can't help doing that. But yes, I mean, just even little references to things. One of the most fun things as a writer is when you have your close friends and family read your book and they say, when you said this, were you referencing that thing that happened with us? And I'm like, yes. It's almost it's like 98% of the time the answer is like, yes, I definitely. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe. And I remember one of my friends said it makes you realize every book, if you knew the author really well, there would just be all these little things. And it's true, because if you're doing it right, and I think you're taking the care, it's like you're really imbuing this text with yourself, with like all the little pieces of you and all the connections that you have to the people who are important in your life. And I've had that experience too, reading books by close friends. It's bizarre where you're just like, oh, this really feels like a piece of them in a way that I know because I know them. And I think most books are probably like that. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is cool. I'm sure it's fun also, like for the people that know you super personally, to try to find those Easter eggs in the writing.
Yes. Sometimes a little dangerous, but yeah.
The next thing that you're going to get is people requesting to be in your next book. Like, can you put me in?
Yes. Well, and I'm actually a little bit behind on the next book in the series, but I remember Catherine and I interviewed Anthony Horowitz because he has his Hawthorne series, the one where he wrote himself as the sidekick into his books. And I remember we were angling for him to have podcasters in a book. So I don't know if that's happened yet, but I'm just putting it out there in the ether right now once again. I really want to be in an Anthony Horowitz book.
So this book has kind of been in your head maybe since 2016 in some form. But how long do you think the development of this book took? And maybe also talk about what your writing process looks like.
Sure. Yeah, I really did the germ of the idea started in November of 2016, but I definitely did not start writing it for a couple of years actually after that. And I remember I have this searing memory of not being able to go to sleep in bed one night and thinking to myself, ugh, you missed it. You missed your chance to write that book that took place, right after the election, because it's been years at this point and the time has passed. And then I was like, you know what? Why don't I just try to write it anyway? So I think it was a good 3 to 4 years actually that it was just kind of when I was still beating my head against the wall with the other manuscript I was working on. The process was much easier, but that's a very relative statement because writing is never easy, at least for me. And I will never pretend that writing is easy. But the process was much easier for me than it had been on that second book. And I could tell that right away. So right when I started writing this book, I was like, oh, this feels right. I'm enjoying this in a way that I haven't enjoyed the writing process in quite some time. I did outline that book, and since then I've now having written the second book, and I've actually also just written the outline for the third book, I've really honed my outlining process. And I think for me, at least, writing a puzzle mystery, I can't do that by the seat of my pants. There probably are writers out there who could, and more power to them, but for me, it's too risky because the structure is so important and it could all just fall apart if you haven't thought of all the pieces. I don't want to have that realization when I'm on page 283 of a 300-page novel. So I actually, and podcast listeners will appreciate this, the mystery breakdown that Catherine and I developed over probably the first year or so of the podcast, where we would have our victim, our suspects, the world as it appears to be, a bridge of clues, and the world as it actually is. I literally do that outline for my books. I call it my puzzle outline. So I do that outline, which I don't share with anyone. And then I do a chronological chapter by chapter plot outline. That's what I share with my publisher, and that's what gets approved. And then I go off to write. But I really do consult both of those outlines for very different reasons and at different points as I'm writing. And what I worried about before I outlined as much as I did is that it would suck all of the joy out of writing and all of the spontaneity. But I've really found quite the opposite. I find it to be freeing because it allows me to fill in all those little writerly ways, like fill in character and, okay, what are people actually saying in this scene and how is the dialogue actually working and what am I trying to say either in this scene or in the book overall? And I can focus on all of that because I know that the puzzle structure is in place and I have the scaffolding to back me up. And that is something that I really resisted for a while, but I feel much more confident writing mysteries. So my first book, The Decent Proposal, I did not outline that thing whatsoever, and it took me many, many years to do that. And these books, the second book I wrote in months rather than years, and that was just a much more efficient process.
Yeah. You've already made a few allusions to this, but Agatha Christie was obviously an influence in this book. What other author? Just keep reminding people where we're at. Yeah. What other authors have made an influence on you in this book, in your writing, and as you're going forward?
Sure. Well, I mentioned Wilkie Collins, actually, and I really do count him as one of those early sort of formative influences, and especially as to mystery as well. And I have a couple of other Victorian authors. Longtime listeners on the podcast will know that Catherine and I had an ongoing feud of Jane Eyre versus Wuthering Heights, because they really are two literary types. I think most people who are bookish like one of them a lot more than the other. It's just kind of something that holds true. I also think most people who are obsessed with Wuthering Heights really hate Jane Eyre, versus people like me who love Jane Eyre also have a lot of room in our hearts for Wuthering Heights as well. I think Jane Eyre people maybe are just a little bigger hearted. I don't know. But Jane Eyre is like a foundational text for me, not only as a writer, but like literally as a person. It's like if I had to choose a book that was going to be like my personal Bible, and I mean that like with a big B, it might be Jane Eyre. Like I just absolutely love that book. And I don't even love it. Like that book is just, it's a part of me, part of who I am. So there's that. I think like most people who grew up consuming Agatha Christie, Victorian literature, say Greek mythology. I also, surprise, surprise, have read everything by Jane Austen and absolutely love Jane Austen. And that was also important to me, I think, when I was growing up. In terms of mystery, this actually, we were just bringing it up before we started recording, but Tana French is a contemporary mystery writer who I have found very influential just because I think she's such a beautiful writer, and the way that she has been able to do her Dublin Murder Squad series, and now she's kind of moved more into standalones, which I also love. But I think she's really opened out what is possible in the mystery genre in the last couple of years in a way that's very helpful and also just very inspiring.
Yeah, awesome. I think it's time to open it up for some audience Q&A.
Yeah.
Because of our recording, we're going to call on people and then we will repeat the question before Kemper answers it. But do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yeah, so the question is, how did you find the voice for this as you were writing?
Yeah, and thank you for the kind words that you just said about the voice and being relatable and not annoying, hopefully. And maybe can be a little annoying, because we can all be a little annoying sometimes. That's okay. That to be human is to be annoying occasionally, I suppose. I'm not sure how I found the voice. I think that the voice was a key part of the book overall. I mean, I think the book didn't exist without the voice. I will say this is a first-person narrator who is a sidekick. So not surprisingly, I was very much inspired by Hastings. Hastings is one of my very favorite sidekicks and narrators in Christie. Hastings is very different from my ghostwriter, though. He is genial and kind of, a doofus. And Christie did that because the challenge of having a first-person narrator who's your sidekick in a mystery is that they can't be all that smart, because if they were, the mystery would be 20 pages long, because he'd be like, oh, that's why they did it. So Christie made Hastings unintelligent in certain ways and interesting in others. And what I wanted to do was to create someone who wasn't very good at deductions and often couldn't see the forest for the trees, which I think is a characteristic that many smart people have, actually. I think she's someone who can sometimes get tunnel visioned about things, including herself. She lets the walls close in on herself. And even though she is extremely intelligent in certain ways, when it comes to investigating, when it comes to synthesizing, the sort of synthesis that has to be done when you are an amateur detective, that is something that she is not good at. But that doesn't mean that she can't be smart and snarky and fun and all those other qualities. So being able to create someone like that, like once I kind of figured out who she was and how that would work in terms of the mystery and her relation to the mystery, that was a huge part of figuring out the book.
Other questions?
Yes.
So the question was, would your ghostwriter say Marple or Poirot?
Which is the question that I force everyone on the podcast to answer so cruelly. Wow. That's a really good question. I've never thought about it. I'm totally stumped right now because I think you could go either way. And oddly, I kind of feel like she'd say Poirot, and mainly because that would really irritate me as a Marpleite. But I think she might be one of those people who enjoys the gonzo element of the Poirot books so much that ultimately she'd go for Poirot, and who might get irritated by, the way that Miss Marple has to set traps for people in the end, and how it's all sort of based on human instinct, and it's so internal. I think that might frustrate her and not be her favorite mysteries to read. I think she might find the Poirots more satisfying. But that really is, I'm just thinking aloud here. So I'm sure you could make an argument easily to say Marple, but I'm going to stick with that. Good question. Wow. Yes.
Yeah, the question is, when Kemper reads a mystery novel, is he usually able to figure out who did it?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because there are a bunch of ways in which Catherine and I were a great counterpoint for the podcast, and I think such good pairs. I mean, we did often agree on a lot of stuff. Sometimes I wished we disagreed a little bit more on our responses to Christie novels, but she was a Poirot person, and I was a Marple person. She was Wuthering Heights. I was Jane Eyre. But one of, I think, the most significant ways in which we diverged is that Catherine was an extremely active mystery reader. So she loved spoiling books for people, like her friends. I mean, she wouldn't go up to strangers and do this, but her close friends and family, she loved being like, oh, I figured out who did it in 2 seconds. It was blah, blah, blah. And you'd be like, I'm only halfway through the book. And she was also a crossword fanatic. Like, she not only was good at the crossword, like she could do any New York Times crossword in like 20 minutes. And I am the opposite. I am an incredibly passive mystery reader. So I almost never even try to solve them. So I haven't exercised the muscle, and I don't have much of a mystery solving muscle when I'm reading my mysteries. And that's because I actually really love being able to appreciate what the author is doing when the solution is presented to me. And I think if I'm too inside of it and trying to play that game, which many people do when they're reading, I don't get that same appreciation. And it's the same appreciation I bring to any book that I read in any genre, where it's more like, show me what a beautiful sentence you can write, and like where you're going with this story. And oh my God, I can't believe that that's where this character ended up. But in a mystery, there's more specificity, I think, to those moments where you're surprised. But for me, being a passive reader allows me to enjoy those moments more. And there are more of us than you would think, too. Like, there are a lot of people that read mysteries passively. And I remember that was one of the things Edmund Wilson, the literary critic, when he excoriated mystery readers in Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd, his mid-20th century screed against detective fiction, which he just thought was trash. Like, really trash. He was like, he couldn't believe that there were people who read mysteries and didn't try to solve them, because he was like, what is the point? Because this is not literature and it's terrible. And it's basically like doing a crossword, but like, I don't know, like just like putting in random letters. And I just completely disagree, because I think, as evidenced by, writers like Tana French and Agatha Christie and P.D. James and Dorothy Sayers and Niall Marsh, there are so many interesting writers in the mystery genre whose writing can be enjoyed on a non-puzzle sort of a level. To me, that's the significant bonus. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I love mystery as much as I do. But yeah, so I actually don't try to solve them, and I almost never do, especially when it comes to Christie. Christie almost always fools me. I actually can't even really truly think of a Christie book where I had solved it beforehand. But I will just say, and I promise I'm almost done answering this question, I mentioned the podcast has a Patreon account, so it's a little sort of side project that requires a fee, a subscription fee. But the most recent episode involved a Niall Marsh novel called Overture to Death. And I haven't really read that much Niall Marsh, and a lot of the other patrons were saying, you have to read more Niall Marsh. She's one of the queens of crime. And I really enjoyed the book, but halfway through, something happened, and I was like, oh no. Did so-and-so do it because of this? And I was like, if it was a Christie, there would be some other twist, and I'd feel like an idiot for having thought that. But that was it. And I solved, not even trying, I solved the Niall Marsh. And it was a wonderfully written book, and especially on a character level, I really loved so much of what she was doing. But I finished it, and I was like, well, that's why Christie is Christie. So.
Yeah. 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 To repeat the question, would you ever write a book that has characters that kind of exemplify Miss Marple and Poirot in the same story with your ghostwriter?
Yes, I think so. I've never thought about it that way, but that's a very helpful model. So thank you. And that's really interesting. Do you mean as to who they, or like the way that they solve crimes, kind of?
The way that they solve crimes, not actually
Yeah.
physically, like, rewriting Miss Marple and rewriting Poirot.
Yes.
So, their characteristics.
Yeah, the characteristics, bringing in the characteristics and
the
of
way
each character.
and the different ways that I was just getting clarification that it's also as to the different ways that they solve their crimes. And yes, I mean, because I think that there's room for both in the same story, for both approaches in the same book, and even maybe calling out both approaches. That would be, ooh, this is okay. I'm gonna have to write some notes after this. It's very, very interesting. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, have you thought about having any visuals of your characters, for example, casting them as if they were in a film?
Yeah, as some podcast listeners know, I live in Los Angeles. I was a manager actually before I turned to full-time writing for screenwriters. My husband is actually a TV writer. So I'm sort of tangentially within that world, and we're exploring opportunities right now, but it's really, there's certainly nothing concrete in terms of film or television adaptations of these books, but I would love, to do something with that, of course. In terms of my own visuals, it's funny, and this will be another annoying writer answer, but you'd think that I might have an actor in mind, but I think when you spend as much time with these characters as you do when you're actually writing a book about them, they become so real, or I guess so robust in my head, that when I think of them, when I picture them, I'm picturing them in a weird way. So it's never an actor. It's always in the way that I guess, people in our lives, obviously, when you picture them, you're picturing their actual face. So it's just this sort of real sense of who they are and what my somewhat fuzzy internal portrayal of what their face looks like. That's what I see. I don't really see an actor. So I'm amazingly unhelpful for someone who is tangential to the world of Hollywood when it comes to trying to cast these people. But maybe, hopefully someday, fingers crossed, I could be like, oh, well, yes, there's something in production. This is who is, playing this character. And that would be really great to see.
Do you have anyone on a wish list of like, maybe they don't exactly exemplify, but be like, I would love to work with this person?
With this one, no. I mean, no one that I think that I'm too scared to even say anything.
Put it out there.
Put it out there. If anything can come about, I will be thrilled. Yes.
The question is, what did you do to research and learn about the ghostwriting process so that you could include it in the novel?
I did do some research into ghostwriting, but I think probably one of the reasons that this book was relatively easy, was easier for me to write than what I was trying to write before, is that she's a writer. So it is a little bit write what you know. And I had been struggling with writing and living this life as a writer for a couple of years leading up to this book. And that immediately was like a way into who she was. And I think ghostwriting's kind of having a moment. There are a lot of like high profile, and especially in celebrity memoir as well. I think there are a number of very well-regarded writers who have written splashy celebrity memoirs in which their writing has really been lauded. And I was very much aware of those people. Like, for example, there was a New Yorker writer who wrote Demi Moore's celebrity memoir. That was one that I always had in my head. And it's actually a really good memoir. It feels like Demi Moore's voice. It's very well written and just sort of very evocatively written. So I think that was sort of my way in to the ghostwriter. And some of those ghostwriters have also written very eloquently about the process and, the fact that there's been ghostwriting for as long as there's been writing. And I always wanted to portray it not as something that's cheap or tawdry, which I think sometimes ghostwriting can get a bad rap. Like, even though this might not be where she thought her career was going to go, she really does pour a lot of passion and care into what she does. And I wanted to explore that as well in this first book. And I definitely will continue to explore that in future books.
I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. Yeah.
Yes.
So would you consider doing a podcast about the Jane Austen books?
The question is, would you consider doing a video about the Jane Austen books?
This has come up before. And actually, before she passed away, Catherine was working on another podcast where she was looking at YA, young adult books, and she had recorded a couple of episodes of it. I was not involved in that, though. And I have always said, I think I'm a one author podcast shop. It's really, there's something specific to Agatha Christie for me, not because I don't love all these other authors, but I think to do it in the exhaustive and sometimes exhausting way that I have, I think that I want to maintain the focus on Christie. Also because, the podcast, obviously the ranking project is over. We're done ranking all of her novels. I am by no means at a loss for episodes. Like, they really did. They just keep on coming, and there's always more to talk about. At this point, I know so many people within the Christie scholar community and Christie enthusiast community. There's constantly new material, either new adaptations, new continuation novels or short stories, new works of scholarship as to what she's doing. There are other Christie podcasts now as well, which is fantastic. I love that I have more people out there who are chattering about Christie. So I plan to keep on doing this podcast, and maybe there are some Jane Austen podcasts that we can listen to. I'm sure someone must have done a Jane Austen podcast, but for now it's just Christie.
Well, Kemper, thank you so much for this conversation. To wrap up, can you remind us what's next and what we can anticipate coming after The Busybody?
Yes. So my second novel in this series will come out in January 2025. The idea is that they will come out 1 year apart. And the title of it is Loose Lips. That will be next. And I'd also, love to write some other standalone mysteries. Actually, for now, I'm really enjoying the mystery genre as a writer and obviously still as a podcast host. There's just so much that you can do within the genre. It's such a very expansive category, I think. That's probably my favorite thing about it. So I feel like I have lots to play around with for a long time to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kemper. Thank you for letting me take over as host on your podcast
This was lovely.
today. I have had a blast. So, and I can't wait to maybe talk to you about the next one.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you again to Elizabeth Bosscher and to Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan for hosting me. That was a lovely event. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, as you can probably tell from that live recording. And I also want to say thank you to all the independent bookstores and libraries who have hosted me over the course of my promotion for The Busybody. It is so important to support independent bookstores and libraries because they do so much crucial work within local communities, recommending books and just generally nurturing an environment for book lovers. There's nothing like it. There's no one else doing that work out there. And you know what? This episode is dropping on Friday, April 26th. Saturday, April 27th, just so happens to be Independent Bookstore Day here in the United States. So go out to your local independent bookstore and buy a book. It doesn't even have to be The Busybody. Hopefully you already bought that one. All right, for my next episode, I will be bringing you the episode I thought I was going to bring you during my book tour, which is my rundown of the top 10 Monsieur Poirots and the top 10 Miss Marples, my ranking from 10 to 1 of the actors playing them in all those screen adaptations of Christie on the big and small screens that are available to us. This is going to be a way to holistically take stock of what is available to us when it comes to adaptations of Christie's two most popular and prolific detectives. I'm surprised I've never done this before, and in a way it's preparation for my panel at this year's Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay in September, where I and my co-panelists will be crowning Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation. By the way, there are a handful of tickets left still for the festival. So if you haven't yet gone to the website for the festival, I'm including it in the notes. Get them while they're hot. So that will be my next episode. I encourage you to visit the podcast's Patreon page. You can always click on the link in the notes if you are jonesing for more All About Agatha content. You can find it over there on Patreon. For May's episode, which will be the 5-year anniversary of the Patreon account, believe it or not, I am going to be doing an episode all about Ripley. Like many of you, I have been enjoying the recent Steve Zalian adaptation of Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, and I'm taking the opportunity to talk about The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith, the text, as well as this recent Netflix adaptation written and directed by Steve Zalian in glorious black and white, the 1999 Anthony Minghella film adaptation of The Talented Mr. Ripley, starring Matt Damon, Jude Law, and Gwyneth Paltrow, and Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Cate Blanchett, and Jack Davenport. That's a favorite movie of mine. So I'll be discussing that, as well as Purple Noon, the glorious 1960 French film directed by René Clément, based on The Talented Mr. Ripley. So it's going to be all Ripley all the time over on Patreon. Come join me if you would like. You can, of course, email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books. And of course, you can buy my debut mystery novel, The Busybody. You've heard a little bit about it on this episode. Don't really have to promote it, but I do just want to point out that the links are in the show notes, as they always are, should you want to avail yourself of a copy in the US, the UK, Australia, or New Zealand. And I encourage you, as I always do, to leave the podcast a rating and or a review. It warms my heart, and we are so close to my goal of 1,000 reviews on Apple Podcasts, but we're not quite there yet. So if you're listening to this and you haven't yet left a rating, not even a review, just a rating, please take pity on me and just leave a rating to bump up those numbers the little extra bit that it needs. I believe we're at 985 right now. All right, see you next time. Bye.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.